Back in the 80s, my family and I would often drive a lot to visit my grandparents. There were two routes to get there: the smooth and straight, or Route 666, or US 191 as it is called now, with all its twists and curves. True to its name, it was a winding stretch of road that twisted and turned through the mountains, often making people sick from the constant curves. But my grandfather loved it. He enjoyed the scenic views, the feeling of being far away from the busyness of the city, and the challenge of navigating such a tricky road. By the time we took that drive, it was almost desolate, only passing through a couple of small, sleepy towns along the way. That particular evening, we were heading back after visiting family. It was dusk, and I remember the sky was fading from warm orange to deep blue as we wound our way through the mountains. Soon, darkness would envelop the entire road. There was something eerie about this road at night. It was remote, with no streetlights and almost no other cars in sight. You could drive for miles without seeing another vehicle, and the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. The trip took about 2 hours, and by the time we were 45 minutes in, night had fallen completely. We were surrounded by darkness, the only light coming from the car's headlights carving out the narrow road ahead of us. As we drove, my grandfather started to slow down, something he rarely did on that road. Curious, I leaned over from the back seat, peering between the front seats to see what was going on. That's when I saw it, a huge tree log, stretching across the road, completely blocking our path. My grandfather didn't hesitate. The moment he saw the log, he didn't try to investigate or wonder if it had fallen naturally. He knew something was wrong. Without saying a word, he threw the car into reverse, his face calm but focused. I could feel the tension in the air, even as a kid. There was something about the way he moved that told me this wasn't just an obstacle, it was a trap. He reversed for a few moments, enough to turn the car around, and then slammed his foot on the gas. I was thrown back into my seat as the car lurched forward, speeding away from the tree. My heart was pounding, and instinctively, I turned around to look out the back window. In the fading red glow of the taillights, I saw them. Men, emerging from the trees next to the road. They had flashlights, and even though it was dark, I could make out the glint of metal in their hands. Guns. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. These weren't just random people. They were waiting for us. They had placed the log across the road to force us to stop. We were about to get robbed, maybe worse. The car sped faster, and the men grew smaller in the distance, their flashlights bobbing as they rushed toward where we had stopped just moments before. My grandfather didn't slow down until we were far, far away from that spot, back in the safety of the small towns we had passed earlier. No one spoke for the rest of the drive. My grandmother sat rigid in her seat, clutching her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. I sat in the back, my mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. We had been so close to something terrible. If my grandfather hadn't acted as quickly as he did, if he had hesitated for even a moment, we would have been at the mercy of those men. That was the last time I ever set foot on that road. My grandfather never drove that road again either. After that night, it became clear just how dangerous it had become, especially once the traffic had died off and the road was left isolated. The beauty of the winding curves and breathtaking views wasn't worth the risk anymore. Even now, years later, I still get chills when I think about that night. It wasn't just the threat of being robbed, but the realization that in a place so remote, anything could happen, and no one would know until it was too late. My grandfather's quick thinking saved us that night, and I'll always be grateful for it. But I'll never forget the sight of those men emerging from the trees, waiting for us in the darkness. Driving late at night on I-70 in Colorado, heading towards Utah, can feel like you're on the edge of the world. Stretches of open road, surrounded by nothing but mountains and desert. That night, I was trying to cover as much ground as possible. knowing I had hours ahead of me. It was around 8 p.m. when I pulled into a gas station to fuel up and grab some food for the road. The station was quiet, the kind of place that gets few visitors at that time of night. As I was pumping gas, I noticed two younger women at the pump next to me, filling up their car. They caught my eye, not just because they were attractive, but because of the man standing on the other side of the pump. He was in his late 40s, scruffy and disheveled, and he was staring at them with a focus that made me uncomfortable. He didn't glance around, didn't seem to notice anything else happening around him, just those two women. It made my skin crawl a bit, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was just some creepy guy being, well, creepy. I walked inside the station to grab some snacks for the next few hours of driving. When I came back out, both the women's car and the man's truck were gone. I felt a slight sense of relief, glad they weren't there to be stared at any longer, and figured that was the end of it. Since I still had a long way to go, I decided to take a break and catch a bit of sleep in my car at the gas station before heading back on the road. I hung around for about an hour before finally getting back behind the wheel and heading west again. A few hours into my drive, speeding down the highway to make up for lost time, I stopped at another gas station to stretch my legs and top off my tank. And there, at a picnic table by the station, were the same two women from earlier. They were eating, looking like they had been there for a while, maybe taking a break like I had. I glanced around but didn't see the man from before, though I wasn't exactly searching for him either. But what happened next made my stomach twist in knots. As I watched the women leave, I saw a pair of headlights flick on from the parking lot across the street. It was the same man's truck. He had been sitting there, waiting, and now he was pulling out as soon as they left, following them again. My brain screamed that this was more than just a coincidence. I mean, what were the odds of seeing the same guy, twice, following the same two women, in the middle of nowhere? I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe they were all just headed in the same direction. But something about the whole situation felt wrong. As I pulled out of the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few miles down the road, I spotted the women's car again, and right on their tail was the same truck. Only this time, he wasn't just following them. He was riding their bumper with his high beams on, making it impossible for them to see. It was aggressive, threatening. At that point, I had seen enough. I slowed down and kept a distance behind the truck, trying to figure out what to do. About 10 minutes later, the women pulled over, most likely hoping that the guy would pass and leave them alone. For a moment it seemed to work. The truck kept going, disappearing down the road. I thought about going over to check on them, but before I could make a move, they pulled back onto the highway. I figured the situation was over, but about a mile later, I noticed the guy's truck again. He had pulled off to the side of the highway, waiting. As soon as the women drove by, he pulled back onto the road and started following them once more. That was it. Too many things had lined up. The way he was following them, the timing of it all. It wasn't random. I pulled off to the side of the road again, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to overreact, but my gut told me something was very wrong. I grabbed my phone and called the cops, explaining what I had seen. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie, and I felt a little ridiculous even telling them the story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, if no one stepped in. 15 minutes later, I saw flashing lights in the distance. The cops had caught up and pulled the man over. I drove by slowly, my heart racing as I passed the scene. The man was standing next to his truck, talking to the officers. His face was hard to make out in the dark, but I couldn't forget that same disheveled, creepy look I'd seen at the gas station hours earlier. I don't know what the cops found, or if anything came of it. Maybe he was just a guy going in the same direction as those women, but the way he acted, waiting for them, following them so aggressively, something about it just didn't sit right. Maybe I'd watched too many horror movies. Or maybe I'd saved those women from something much worse. I'll never know for sure. But in that moment, I knew one thing. Trust your instincts. Better to overreact and be wrong than to stay quiet and regret it later. It was one of those nights where the road seemed to stretch on forever. Just me and the hum of the engine, winding through a dark, empty forest. There were no streetlights, just the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the thick trees on either side of the road. It felt like I was the only person for miles. It was late, probably close to midnight, and the kind of eerie stillness you only find in the middle of nowhere had settled over everything. As I drove, my mind wandered, more focused on getting home than anything else. The road was mostly empty, with not a single car in sight, which was a relief because there were no lights, no signs, just the dark, and the occasional animal darting into the brush. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. Then, out of nowhere, she appeared. A woman, seemingly from nowhere, leaped into the middle of the road. She wasn't standing on the side, trying to flag me down. She jumped out right in front of my car. I barely had a second to react, slamming the brakes and swerving hard into the oncoming lane. I crossed over the painted median, praying there wasn't another car coming from the opposite direction. The screech of the tires and the weight of the car shifting made my heart pound in my chest. Luckily, the road was empty. I caught a glimpse of her as I swerved. Her wide eyes, the way her arms flailed as if she was trying to stop me, or maybe just desperate to grab onto something. She wasn't standing still either. She was staggering, moving erratically, and I could tell something was wrong. The whole situation was wrong. Her clothes were disheveled, and her face was pale under the harsh light of my headlights, her hair wild, as if she'd been running for a while. My car jerked back into the correct lane as I tried to regain control. I sped past her, my heart still racing, hands white-knuckling the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, I watched as she disappeared back into the darkness behind me, swallowed by the night. There was no way I was going to stop. Something about the whole situation felt off. I wasn't sure if she was in trouble or if she was trouble, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. As soon as I got far enough away, I pulled over, trying to calm my nerves. My hands were still shaking, adrenaline coursing through me as I thought about what just happened. I debated going back, maybe calling the police, but something told me to just keep going. The way she had jumped out like that, it was like she had no sense of what she was doing, like she was lost or out of her mind. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I scrolled through the news, trying to find something that might explain what I'd seen. That's when I came across the police report. The woman I had seen had been hit by another driver just minutes after I passed by. Apparently, she had been intoxicated and was running from the police. The thought of it made my stomach twist. She had been on the run, scared, disoriented, and in her panic, she had thrown herself into the road. It made sense now, her wild movements, the way she seemed so out of control. But what stuck with me was the driver who hit her. I couldn't stop thinking about what they must have felt, seeing her too late to stop, with no room to swerve like I had. The guilt, the shock. It must have been overwhelming. It was pure luck that I had managed to avoid her, but that other driver, they weren't so lucky. I hope she's all right, though I never found out what happened to her afterward. I can't imagine what she must have been thinking, why she was running, or what led her to that dark stretch of road in the first place. And I can't imagine what went through the mind of the person who hit her, having no idea they'd be involved in something so surreal and tragic. Sometimes, I think back to that night, the feeling of almost losing control of the car, the way she seemed to appear out of nowhere, and the brief, haunting image of her face, wide-eyed in the headlights. It's the kind of moment that stays with you, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, how fragile life really is, and how sometimes we're just a split second away from something we'll never be able to forget.